Welcome to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. I'm Ken Hicks, and we've been talking about different kinds of liberation ideologies. We talked a little bit about the different kinds of characteristics that they tend to share, the idea that certain groups of people are somehow subject to differential treatment, and they all have different kinds of audiences. They all point to different kinds of ways in which groups are disadvantaged. We're going to continue our discussion. We began talking about black liberation in our last presentation. We're going to continue that and complete our discussion of that, of black liberation. And then we're going to begin our discussion of women's liberation. So as I stated in my first class, I want to be clear. Nothing in the presentation of this material is intended to create or cultivate stereotypes, to stigmatize any certain races, to place blame on any one race for racism against another, to assign moral burdens to one race, or to divide individuals or groups by race. I am simply addressing how these different ideologies view issues like race or gender or sexual orientation, and we're just looking at how these different groups argue from a certain perspective. And so we talked a little bit about sort of the assimilationist view of black liberation, the idea that if blacks, if certain obstacles to black equality were removed, that blacks would be in a position to improve their lives. And that is sort of, the one perspective, the perspective adopted by, for example, Booker T. Washington, and certainly Martin Luther King to an extent. When you listen to the "I Have a Dream" speech, and the idea, that the point of the dream was that all people, including black children, for example, would be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. It's one of the reasons why the "I Have a Dream" speech is so powerful and resonates so strongly. So we also talked about the black nationalist viewpoint, and that is the idea that from that perspective, white folks are simply not going to accept black people as equal, and that it is far more important for black folks to form their own communities, and indeed in some instances to form their own political community, their own political organizations, their own forms of government. And so when you look at this slide, that again, from the black nationalist perspective, freedom, the agent are black people. The obstacles, are racist beliefs and attitudes, and the goal is black pride, black power, dignity, and independence, and that's not too dissimilar from the integrationist argument. I'm going to kind of close our discussion of black liberation talking about a very important article that was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It was written in 2014 in the political magazine The Atlantic, and the title of the article was "The Case for Reparations," which again he challenged the idea that we now live because we had a black president at that point in time, and he had just been reelected in 2012. Basically, Coates said that he had worked on the case for reparations for 2 years, I believe. And again, he is attempting to exhaustively document what he perceives as the harm inflicted on black Americans by slavery and by persistent racial animus that has lasted into the present. He begins his discussion by talking about Chicago suburb, North Lawndale, Illinois, which he describes as on the wrong end of every socioeconomic indicator. In 1930, Lawndale's population was 112,000. Today, as of 2014, the population had shrunk to 36,000. The neighborhood was 92% black. Its homicide rate of 45 per 100 was triple the rate of Chicago as a whole. And let's keep in mind, Chicago has a pretty high homicide rate. The infant mortality rate was 14 per 1,000, more than twice the national average. 43% of the neighborhood's inhabitants lived below the poverty line. He also notes that North Lawndale is an extreme portrait of the trends that ail black Chicago. The average per capita income of Chicago's white neighborhoods is nearly 3 times that of its black neighborhoods. The black neighborhood with the highest incarceration rate, which is West Garfield Park, had a rate more than 40 times as high as the white neighborhood with the highest incarceration rate, which was Clearing. As the Harvard sociologist Robert Sampson observed, this is a staggering differential even for community level comparisons, a difference of kind, not degree. And so he's basically making a very important point here, and he's establishing again the argument that in many black communities these problems are endemic, and they're not necessarily, according to him, matters of choice. To quote Coates, Chicago's impoverished black neighborhoods are not simply poor, they're ecologically distinct. The income gap between black and white households is roughly the same as it was in 1970. Sociological studies have shown that roughly 4% of whites and 62% of blacks have been raised in poor neighborhoods in the middle of the 20th century. A generation later, a replication of that study showed virtually nothing had changed. So he makes the point that blacks are significantly less wealthy. They have had persistently less access to the kind of work that would enable them to generate intergenerational wealth. He notes a Pew Research Center that estimates that white households are worth roughly 20 times as much as black households. Sociologist Patrick Sharkey, who kind of specializes in urban comparative studies, shows that black families earning $100,000 a year typically live in the kinds of neighborhoods inhabited by white families that are earning about $30,000 a year. And so, again, he's drawing an inference. An unsegregated America might see poverty spread across the country far more randomly. And for Coates, the argument is, instead, the concentration of poverty has been paired with the concentration of melanin, which again is the idea of blacks. People with black skin have been selected out for impoverishment. He notes that there is a precedent to the idea of reparations. Belinda Royal, who was born in Ghana, who was basically captured and sold into slavery and lived in Massachusetts for a period of time in the 18th century before slavery was gotten rid of. She petitioned when her, in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, when her slave owner left the country, she petitioned for reparations and was actually given a payment from the state, which was taken as forfeit from the estate of her former owner. And so she's, basically, Ta-Nehisi Coates is making an argument that there is a precedent for this kind of thing at this state level. And he's also making the argument that, all too often for many white folks, the argument is that we had a civil war, we got rid of slavery, we had the Civil War amendments, legally that settles the matter. And the problem for Coates is that blacks weren't simply left to their own devices in the aftermath of the Civil War. They were terrorized. They really were not given the opportunity to move out of the South, to move out of the places where they were enslaved. And he's basically making the point that in the Deep South, a second slavery ruled. In the North, banks and citizens colluded to pin black people in ghettos, where they were overcrowded, overcharged, and undereducated. And police brutality, both in the South and the North, was universal, as was the belief that, widely shared by whites in the 19th century, that blacks were rightful targets of discrimination. So he raises John Conyers Jr., who has since passed away, but was a member of Congress in 2014 when he wrote the article. And he noted that Conyers has entered into every legislative session at the start of every legislative session that he's been a part of, which goes back 30-something years, that that he has called for legislation, calling for a congressional study of slavery and its lingering effects. He's not calling for reparations. He's simply calling for a study of what he and many other blacks have characterized as systemic racism that has basically prevented blacks from achieving anything like an equal position in society. Coates notes the barrage of questions that are related to reparations whenever the issue is raised. When I was in school, we dealt with these kinds of issues in our civics class. We would be asked, do you think that black Americans should be paid reparations for slavery? And of course, that always produced a very lively debate. And a common attitude among most white students was, I didn't have anything to do with slavery. Why should I be paying for it? So other questions is, again, who will be paid? How much will be paid? Who will pay? And those are, I think, legitimate questions. And so Conyers, proposal to study the issue was simply calling for recommendations for appropriate remedies related to reparations. And the point that Ta-Nehisi Coates is making in 2014 is that subject is never taken up, either under Democrats or Republicans. Conyers' proposals have never made it to the floor, have certainly never made it out of any committee to which they had been assigned. And so it's very common for civil rights advocates to observe that people who talk about reparations are considered leftist lunatics. And so for Coates, his argument is that to proudly claim the veteran but disown the slave owner is patriotism a la carte. It's being able to take a highly selective view of history, to turn it into hagiography, and to ignore the consequences of the decisions that led to the institution of slavery. And as Coates writes, if Thomas Jefferson's genius matters, then so too does his taking of Sally Hemings' body. And if you don't know, Sally Hemings was a slave that was owned by Thomas Jefferson, who Jefferson is widely acknowledged at this point, fathered at least one child by. So it's important to recognize that slavery enabled Americans, not just Southerners, but Americans broadly, to accrue enormous wealth. According to Coates, and again I am speaking, this is Coates' argument, Coates argues that America begins in black plunder and white democracy, two features that are not contradictory. When I teach this class, I often say, democracy is really only as good as the people practicing it. Because democracy is when we say the people rule, the question is always, who are the people, right? Who is this circle of we that we allow into the political community? Coates argues, and I believe he's correct, that American law was used to denigrate blacks and to elevate whites to citizenship status. He documents the ways in which colonial laws placed blacks beneath the law. For example, in 1650, Virginia mandated all persons except Negroes were required to carry arms. It's important, we talk about keeping and bearing arms. In other words, they were expected to be trained in the use of firearms. Negroes, however, were not. In 1664, Maryland law decreed that any English woman who married a slave must live as a slave of her husband's master. In 1705, the Virginia Assembly passed a law allowing for the dismemberment of unruly slaves, but forbidding masters from whipping a Christian white servant naked without an order from a justice of the peace. And so he also cites a quote from John Calhoun, who is one of the great nullifier, if you will. He was the promulgator of the doctrine of nullification. Served as Secretary of War and served as Vice President, I believe, under Andrew Jackson. He made the point that the two great divisions of society are not the rich and the poor, but white and black. And for Calhoun, who was then writing in 1848, that meant that all the The poor as well as the rich belong to the upper class and are respected and treated as equals. But people who are not in the white category have no protection. And Coates notes that in 1860, the majority of the people living in South Carolina and Mississippi, almost half of those living in Georgia, and about 1/3 of all Southerners were on the wrong side of Calhoun's line, which again gets back to this idea of who belongs within the circle of we. And Coates is making an argument that blacks have never, even into the 1960s, been consistently included as eligible or as meriting equal dignity. He notes that slavery was not simply about servitude and about taking profit off the labor of slaves. Wealth was derived from slavery, and that included the vending of the black body and the sundering of the black family. The production and sale of slaves became an industry unto itself, producing tens of millions in profits to antebellum slave owners. At a time when communication was primitive, the parting of black families meant black husbands never seeing their wives or children, which Coates characterizes as a kind of murder. Here we find the roots of American wealth and democracy in the for-profit destruction of the most important asset available to any people, the family. So, again, and I've heard, that especially in like secondary education, you've had teachers attempt to try and convey to students the poignancy of how slavery separated families, and to ask students to act out what it would be like to serve, to be a slave and to lose a loved one. And I understand how that can be discomforting, especially for young kids. As adults, though, we have to look with clear eyes at the consequences of what the systematic tearing up of families, however formed. Again, they formed within the bonds of slavery, but they were families nonetheless. These people loved one another. They cared for one another. They were human beings, and they were taken because they were more valuable to the slave owner as an asset to be sold rather than as a unit of a family. And he notes that in the aftermath of the Civil War, Reconstruction ultimately failed. It was defeated by groups of people that he characterized, that they characterized themselves as the redeemers. And for Coates, again, this was the redemption of a society built for whites and not for blacks. There was a wave of terrorism that swept through the South in the aftermath of Reconstruction. Black schools and churches were burned. Black voters and candidates were intimidated and often murdered. Blacks registered to vote in states of the former Confederacy very quickly plunged below 10% the minute the U.S. Army left those states. And in fact, you had successive instances where black people who served in war were denied the right to vote and killed when they attempted to assert the right to vote. We all know, we've been, I think most people have been taught at this point. I know that their textbooks in Oklahoma did not include the Tulsa race massacres until fairly recently, but we know about the Tulsa race massacre. What we don't know is the broader context within which it took place. And Coates, contextualizes the Tulsa race massacre. He notes that in the aftermath of World War I, as hundreds of thousands of soldiers came home from war, the demobilization of soldiers after the war, which put black and white veterans into competition for scarce jobs, produced a succession of racist pogroms against dozens of cities ranging from Chicago to Washington, D.C. If you look up race riot and you look at it sequentially, you'll find it clustered around certain dates. And from 1919 to about 1923, there's a huge spike in these things that we call race riots. And what most often they were white mobs invading black neighborhoods and burning down homes, beating people, oftentimes killing people. We know that estimates within the Tulsa Race Massacre rise to as many as 300 people, maybe more. We're not really sure. Census wasn't perfect back then. The work of mobs, again, Coates writing, the work of mobs was a rabid and violent rendition of prejudices that extended into the upper reaches of American government. And I would note in 1919, you had a Democratic president by the name of Woodrow Wilson, who was president. He was a Southerner. He was an educated man, but he was still a deeply racist bigot. And he was the one responsible for federalizing segregation. Up to that point, it had been Republican presidential administrations, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, who was a New Yorker and not a bigot like most Southern Democrats were in that period. He's the one that basically instituted segregation at the federal level in the executive branch. And again, it gets back to this idea that, whenever blacks, and again, the point was blacks fought to get access to going into war. They openly advocated, we want to be able to fight for our country. They believed that would earn them respect. And they came home, and what they got instead were pogroms. And if you don't know what that word is, it's P-O-G-R-O-M. And it reflects a kind of violence. Ordinarily, we apply it to Russia and Eastern Europe and the things that they did to Jewish communities. But it is a perfectly accurate depiction of what happened in the United States in these periods, especially in the immediate aftermath of World War I, and in places after World War II as well, and really throughout the early part of the 20th century. That's history. These are documented facts. He's not just pulling these things out. He is emphasizing them to make a point, which is to say, there's never been a moment where blacks couldn't build something that whites couldn't tear down. He notes that segregation was an integral part of the New Deal. The New Deal coalition included blacks, it included working class whites in the Midwest, and it included Southern whites. It was the largest electoral coalition ever assembled by either political party. But a key element of the New Deal coalition was the avoidance of any kind of intrusion into the politics of the South, into segregation in the South. And I like the quote from Coates, "The Jim Crow South was the one collaborator America's democracy could not do without." And again, the point was that Southern white politicians were populist. They were willing to go after the big corporations. They were willing to go after the folks that they thought they were populists themselves. They had a problem with the bankers and with the big finance folks. So a critical part of the New Deal coalition, Southern Democrats insisted on protecting the Southern way of life. And so to that end, think about it from the perspective of, for example, Social Security. Social Security, when it was passed in 1935, expressly excluded farm workers and domestics from access to the Social Security program. And so in 1935, when it was written, if you look at this picture of Franklin Roosevelt signing the Social Security Act, at least two of those guys, the one on his right shoulder and the other guy in the white suit, those are what we call bourbon Democrats. They are Southern Democrats, and they were racists. So in 1935, 65% of blacks nationwide and 70 to 80% of Southern blacks were ineligible for the benefits under the program. The same was true of the GI Bill. Remember, if you don't know anything about the GI Bill, it is one of the most kind of transformational pieces of legislation that was ever passed. It was passed in the immediate aftermath of the World War II, and it basically was a guarantee that if you served in uniform, you would have access to education and to loans to buy a home. Black veterans were systematically denied access to the low-interest loans that were provided in Title III of the GI Bill. So under the federal law, Title III left blacks to deal with local banks and local Veterans Administration folks that were, so hostile to getting blacks into homes. And so many blacks were disqualified that, as one scholar said, it's simply more accurate to say that blacks could not use Title III to get a home. And what ultimately occurred in the immediate aftermath of World War II was that while whites were getting access to single-dwelling homes, blacks were being shunted into multi-use apartment complexes, which ultimately would end up becoming, the projects. And it's important to keep in mind that a private industry, the real estate industry, was wholly committed to segregation of neighborhoods from the early 20th century into the late 20th century, when during the Carter administration and the Johnson administration, redlining practices were finally denied. As Coates writes, the American real estate industry believed segregation to be a moral principle. The National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics warned that realtors could lose their licenses if they were found to have been instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood any race or nationality or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. And property values becomes that coda for segregation. A 1943 real estate brochure made clear that such undesirables included madams, bootleggers, gangsters, and a colored man of means who was giving his children a college education and thought they were entitled to live among whites. That was the attitude. And so according to Coates, you get in the aftermath of World War II the making of the second ghetto. And he makes a point that segregation as a government policy was widely popular among whites. And he's focusing on Chicago because it makes a really kind of useful, illustration of what was happening nationally. He speaks about the Park Manor demonstrations in 1946, where a mob of thousands assembled in Chicago's Park Manor neighborhood to force out a black doctor who had recently moved into the neighborhood. When that black doctor saw those mobs, he got out. The Fernwood riots, after a few black veterans moved into the Fernwood section of Chicago, there were 3 nights of rioting that broke out. Gangs of whites yanked blacks off the streets and beat them. Police largely stood by because protecting blacks would have led to attacks on police. There were only 113 people arrested. 35 black people reported injuries from mob attacks, and shockingly, but no one was killed. He mentions the 1951 Cicero riot, which Cicero is a suburb of Chicago, where thousands of black Chicagoans attacked an apartment building housing a single black family, throwing bricks and Molotov cocktails through the windows and setting apartments on fire. A Cook County grand jury declined to charge the rioters and instead indicted the NAACP attorney, the apartment's white owner, and the owner's attorney and rental agent, charging them with conspiring to lower property values. What does that tell you about the sentiments of people in that period, in the late 1940s and early into the 1950s? Coates notes that when violence and intimidation failed, whites fled to the suburbs, and white flight he characterizes as a triumph of social engineering that was basically facilitated by what is known as redlining. And again, if you don't know what redlining is, it's a process where people, neighborhoods are zoned in a certain way where people simply can't get access to loans to buy the home. And so Coates notes that, frankly, Negro poverty is not white poverty. Today, many liberals mostly view racism not as an active, distinct evil, but as a relative of white poverty and inequality. And he notes that there is a pragmatic urge to employ black poverty as part of a broader struggle to advance, a larger social welfare agenda. The problem is that America was built on the preferential treatment of white people, 395 years of it. And so for Coates to ignore that an important ingredient of the American Republic's foundation was white supremacy is to cover the sin of national plunder with the sin of national lying. The lie ignores the fact that closing the achievement gap will do nothing to close the injury gap. So, what should we do? In the 1970s, an economist calculated the price tag for reparation at roughly $34 billion, which in today's dollars would be about $284 billion. The Yale law professor Boris Bitker calculated the rough price tag by multiplying the number of black Americans in the population by the difference in white and black per capita income. Charles Ogletree, a Harvard University law school professor, pictured on this slide, has advocated, again, a broader, more pragmatic training and public works program that, again, includes all the poor. Because, again, Charles Ogletree notes that if you say that this is going to be a black program, it will very quickly, it will be something like reparations. It will clearly and obviously become a target for attack. But for Coates, again, the argument is to celebrate freedom and democracy while forgetting Americans' origins in a slavery economy is, again, patriotism a la carte. And he notes why reparations is so controversial. It threatens something much deeper: America's heritage, history, and standing in the world. Americans like to think of ourselves as the good guys. And for Coates, he's basically saying the argument is more complex than that. So Coates asks the question, won't reparations divide us? And Coates says, not any more than we are already divided. And I would argue that the past 10 years since that article was written proves him wrong. Okay? I think Coates was wrong. I think that even the modest things that happened, even the fact that we had a black president produced an enormous reactionary backlash that we are continuing to live in right now. I agree with him, though, with a lot of the other concluding points that he makes, including the idea that what is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I am talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Reparations would mean the end of yelling patriotism while waving a Confederate battle flag. That last statement, again, I am a Southerner. I think he is a bit naive on that one. So to close up our discussion of black liberation, again, it's important to keep in mind that within any particular ideological perspective, there are going to be ranges of opinions, ranges of tactical views, ranges of beliefs about the extent to which a particular program is desirable or even necessary. Integrationists and nationalists may agree on reparations, but they represent, again, two basically opposing tendencies. Integrationists prioritize removing legal obstacles that prevent equality of opportunity. Nationalists are more oriented towards internally, developing the cohesiveness of black communities. And the Nation of Islam is an illustration of this nationalist commitment to self-sufficiency. The Nation of Islam, if you don't know who they are, they were led for many years by Elijah Muhammad and then subsequently by Louis Farrakhan. They have tended to focus on internal moments. They have tended to focus on local, community organizing. They have, held multiple large-scale marches. The 1995 Million Man March is an example. They had Million Women and Million Children marches as well. These were all designed to instill in Black Americans a sense of Black community and Black identity. So let's move on and start our discussion of women's liberation. And again, the whole point of feminism is to recognize the ancient roots of the subordination of women and the various waves of feminist movements that have arisen to fight for women's equality. Feminism or women's liberation represents a distinct ideological movement. Most ideological movements are minoritarian in nature. The point of feminism, though, is, women represent more than half of the human race, slightly more than half of the human race. So it's a particularly important and influential, liberation ideology. But it's also subject to persistent misunderstandings. And it's important to keep in mind that feminism is also riven with different kinds of factions and different kinds of interpretations. There are many, many women who would reject the idea that they are feminists. The whole trad wife movement among conservative women, reflects this notion that many women completely embrace a very conventional view of women, and some particularly religious conservative women accept that women should be subordinate to their husbands and should be primarily oriented towards raising children and managing the household. One of the other misunderstandings is the notion that feminism is innately anti-men. There are some feminists who are decidedly hostile to men. There are, for example, lesbian feminists who have no use for men, frankly, and who argue that men are simply the source of patriarchy and that women would be better off forming separate communities. They are, like Black nationalists, they are separatists of a sort. They are a fairly small minority of the feminist community. And they have a lot more to do with the identity politics of the LGBTQ gay pride ideology than with some other brands of feminists. But feminists tend to be united in the opposition to the concept of patriarchy. And now, what exactly is patriarchy? Again, that refers to the attitude that men are intellectually and morally superior to women and have a legitimate claim to control their lives and their bodies, and that this domination is for women's own good. If there is one thing that unites feminists across the spectrum, it is this opposition to patriarchy. And again, I am not trying to tell people or divide people per se. I am saying that people are divided along these lines. That if you are a feminist, you are likely to be aware of the concept of patriarchy and largely likely to agree with it. The idea that women are the weaker sex has ancient roots. Aristotle, was among the first to really kind of comment on women as being the weaker sex. He engaged in what is known as the naturalistic fallacy, asserting that men by nature are better at leadership. He would note that the relation of male to female is by nature a relation of superior and ruler to ruled. You can also cite St. Paul in 1 Timothy 2:12. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Likewise, Thomas Jefferson in a reply to the idea that he should appoint women to positions within the executive branch. Jefferson replied in a letter, "The appointment of a woman to office is an innovation for which the public is not prepared, nor am I." There are also numerous pseudo-scientific studies that sought to marshal evidence to support the idea that women were intellectually inferior, to men. This is again, sort of a long history where men who have felt threatened by strong women have sought to shunt them into the private realm and to prevent them from playing a role in public affairs. So there's a long history of this, the half-hidden history of women's liberation efforts. Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband, who was at the Constitutional Congress at the time in 1776, admonished him to remember the ladies and to be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. To which John Adams replied in a letter to his wife, "I cannot but laugh." At the same time, he had tremendous respect for his wife's intellect. They were relatively equal partners given that particular period of time. You also have the publication in 1792 of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which she'd also written prior to that, A Vindication of the Rights of Man, which was a reply to Edmund Burke's criticisms of the French Revolution. This was again a radical reply to Edmund Burke and to the revolutionaries' call for the rights of man. If you look at the picture, that is Mary Wollstonecraft, who argued for equal access of women to education and advocacy for the proposition that men and women were equal in the eyes of God, although she did not explicitly assert that men and women were in all ways equal. And so let's look for a few minutes at sort of the vindication of the rights of women, or a selection from it. Again, this is a picture or a painting of Mary Wollstonecraft. She died at a very young age. I believe she was 38. She was an English writer and philosopher. Some have characterized her as a feminist. Some have argued that was a bit of a stretch, that she might have been a sort of nascent feminist. She certainly did lead an unconventional life. And her second husband, William Godwin, who I mentioned in an earlier presentation on anarchism, when he kind of wrote a biography of his late wife, had the effect, unfortunately, of damaging her reputation in her recent death. She died at 38 following the birth of her second daughter, Mary Shelley, who was the author of Frankenstein. She died due to sepsis from a ruptured placenta, which was a lamentably common occurrence in the 18th century. Childbearing was a tremendously dangerous prospect, especially for a 38-year-old woman. But she was, she died too young, I would argue. So she's basically extending an argument. In her essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Man, she was again refuting Edmund Burke's critique of the ideals of the French Revolution. In A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she calls for an extension of similar rights and ideals to women themselves. And in this section of A Vindication, she's basically arguing in favor for the development of women's reasoning capacities. And she starts with what she considers to be a common reality, and that is that women have long been viewed as naturally the weaker sex, as naturally weaker in reasoning capacity. And she notes that women often fall prey to the same tendency for short-term thinking as oppressed men do. To quote her, Women are degraded by the same propensity to enjoy the present moment, and at last despise the freedom which they have not sufficient virtue to struggle to attain. And again, the point being, if you have to stand up and demand something, knowing that the price might be high, most human beings are inclined to bow, to be. They are risk averse. They don't want to be singled out for punishment. She speaks about the perfectibility of reasoning. Wollstonecrafts argued that reason consists of the power of improvement. She argued that reason was inconsistent, with the female sex. To that statement, she would say, "Let men prove this, and I shall grant that women exist only for men. I must, however, previously remark that the power of generalizing ideas to any great extent is not very common among men or women." And again, she is pointing to a hard reality. And a great deal of her argument is deeply subversive of the idea of natural aristocracy. Her writings, and she wrote quite a bit in her brief writing career as both a kind of a novelist and as a philosopher. Her writings are shot through with contempt for hereditary aristocracy. She believes that the idle rich were weak, that they were entitled, and that they were frivolous, which I'll play on that note again in a moment. But she's basically saying it's conventional wisdom that reason is inconsistent with the female sex. I'm reminded of one of my favorite movies from the 90s, Shadowlands, which is a movie about C.S. Lewis, the English philosopher and writer and Christian apologist, and his relationship with Joy Davidovich. At one point, he's at a party with a bunch of these Oxford or Cambridge dons. I can't remember which school that he was at, and he's introducing Joy to his colleagues, and one of them says something about animam and animus, that where men have intellect, women have soul. And Joy Davidovich says, I need some clarification. Are you meaning to be insulting, or are you just stupid? And C.S. Lewis kind of leads her away, chuckling. And that's sort of the point that Wollstonecraft is making there. Constantly being confronted with the idea that as a writer, that her writings must simply be the emotions of a woman. She is pointing out that all too often people fail to use their reasoning intellect, and oftentimes use their reasoning for perverse reasons. I'm reminded of Kant's notion of in What is Enlightenment, right? That all too often we fail to be enlightened. We fail to be critical thinkers. We fail to examine those aspects of our lives that may not necessarily be healthy for us. She points to the source of her present, contemporary female's folly as a narrowness of mind and the almost insuperable obstacles preventing the cultivation of female understanding. And again, one of those critical things is the idea that women of her age and of her station were basically, toys to be bartered about. They were bearers of children. They were, advantageous relationships that could be, bartered away for a large dowry. A woman's position in society of that time was dependent on their ability to project this thing that we call virtue, right? Exalted by their inferiority, Wollstonecraft writes, though the very men attracted to this projection are the most inclined to tyrannize over and despise the very weakness they cherish. And again, the point being that for men seeking an advantageous marriage, it was all too often the dowry attached that they cared more about. And the women were often almost an afterthought, in a sense in which, yes, I'll get some children off you, and I will have my lineage guaranteed, but you're an afterthought. The money matters more. Women of that period, according to Wollstonecraft, were banished to a kind of pedestal. She draws the metaphor of women as being like caged birds, confined in cages like the feathered race. Birds, they have nothing to do but plume themselves and stalk with mock majesty from perch to perch, from salon to ballroom and to salon, and back again. For Wollstonecraft, the respect paid to wealth and beauty always attracts the most vulgar eye of common minds. And again, when she talks about a common mind, she's talking about people who care more about money than about things like real love. Where has been found in humanity, let alone among women, one with sufficient strength of mind to abandon these adventitious prerogatives? And again, adventitious is a fancy word for just saying convention, something built up, not something that emerges out of nature or that's something that has some real utility. She draws an extended contrast between the plight of women in their current state and, again, the idle rich. Women's lives most resemble the privileges of those with inherited wealth. And remember, she's talking, she's writing in a period where the excesses of the French aristocracy of Versailles. And she is a woman who traveled to France during the French Revolution. She knows about the idle rich. Ladies bereft of any company other than other ladies fall under the influence of sentiments rather than passion. And again, it gets back to this sense in which these are just a bunch of fan-waving women, gossiping among themselves and, gossiping about women who violate conventions. And Mary Wollstonecraft was one who violated many, many conventions. She pursued a married man for a while between marriages, which was a scandal. While men of the productive classes prepare for professions and other challenges, women have no other scheme to sharpen their faculties. And again, what's the point of being a woman in this period? It's to, go out into society. If you've watched any of the shows on Netflix about women of this particular period. It's not Downton Abbey, although it's kind of similar to that. It's I can't remember the show, but in any event, it's just about your being released into society and you're attracting the best match for your family, less for yourself. But for your reputation. Again, at the end of the day, what matters is that you are marrying into a circumstance that enables you to dress nicely, enables you to attend all the best balls, and it enables you to sit around and sip tea with other women of your station and comment on inane things. And so ultimately, these are frivolous lives. That women of her age were living. Women in general and the rich of both sexes have acquired all the follies and vices of civilization and missed the useful fruit. Civilized women are so weakened by false refinement that respecting morals, their condition is much below what it would have been if they were left in a state nearer to nature. Miserable indeed must be that being whose cultivation of mind has only tended to inflame its passions. So when she's talking about, again, the vindication of the rights of women, is she talking about having, literally women of equal standing to men? I think that was a stretch for her. She reckoned she was a woman with a child. Even though she died in childbirth, she had a child by her first marriage. She understood the need for women. She had been a governess for a period of time and found that she was ill-used in that position. She wanted to have greater opportunities. She believed that women could be both a mother and have a career, have things outside the home that challenged their minds and their reasoning capacity. So she recognized the need for women as sort of the foundation point for family, but she also argued for the need for education and for intellectual challenges for women. Women who are challenged intellectually become better partners for their husbands. They become a source of wise counsel, which history has demonstrated have been some of the best relationships. Wollstonecraft's reply to Francis Bacon, who observed that a man with a wife and children hath given hostages to fortune, for they are impediments to great enterprises. Wollstonecraft would write, I say the same to women. But the welfare of society is not built on extraordinary exertions. And were it more reasonably organized, there would be still less need of great abilities or heroic virtues. So we don't need towering geniuses. We need well-educated people who make good decisions. As an educator, I think she's right. I wholly endorse that particular viewpoint. So for the last 15 minutes or so, we'll talk a little bit, go back to feminism from the 19th and into the 20th century. And the one thing you'll find with feminism, I actually, as a graduate student, I took a graduate seminar on feminism. I was one of, I think there were 12 people in the class. I was the only male in the class. And it was a fun class to be in. Because, and I will tell you, I did not take the class because I was dating anyone or anything like that. I took it because I was genuinely curious about feminism, and because, I wanted to be in the position of what it was like to be in a minority. And I was decidedly in the minority. And the one thing you find as you move into the 20th century is that as feminism develops as a distinctive ideological position, it begins to develop these very separate strands, these very separate approaches, and these very separate audiences. And in this sense, again, although I mentioned that more than half of the human population are women, the audience of feminism begins to telescope and begins to focus on specific narrow groupings of women. And so one thing that begins to happen is a growing militancy as it relates to certain fundamental rights. You have the suffragist movements in England and the United States that really emerges in the middle of the 19th century. One of the most significant things, probably something you may have been taught in one of your history courses, is the Seneca Falls Convention, which included a bunch of women's advocates, a bunch of anti-slavery folks. Frederick Douglass attended the Seneca Falls Convention. A number of temperance movement representatives showed up. And the Seneca Falls Convention, which we could go through that, but it's kind of dull. It's kind of like reading the Constitution or something like that, which is important, and you should know it, but I'm not necessarily going to inflict it upon you in this class. But again, it reflects the concerns of women and women's allies in this period. And that was the sense in which there are certain things that certain kinds of autonomy that should be extended to women. And one of the things that they talked about, again, was the vote. Not everyone at the Seneca Falls Convention favored it, but a strong majority did. There was a growing sentiment towards the right of women to own property. There was, under most property laws in most of the states, women simply were not allowed to own property. Even if they inherited something from their fathers, that became their husband's property when the father died. They believed that was wrong, that needed to be changed. They believed that women should have a right to divorce abusive husbands. These are things that we generally look at today and think, why not? Well, those were controversial issues in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century especially. And remember the year I'm talking about. I've spoken about this in both about conservatism and about socialism, that 1848 was a year of enormous, momentous change. There were insurrections and rebellions throughout Europe. And so, this reflects this sense in which population growth had reached a point, and interconnectivity had reached a point where people were just not satisfied with the vestiges of feudalism as a way of governing and controlling populations. People were more and more insistent that they had a right to do certain things as human beings, and women began to be part of that cacophony of voices. And so you had these overlapping groups of kind of alliances of people, of women's rights advocates, of anti-slavery movement people, and of temperance argument. If you don't know what temperance is, they were the folks that ended up banning alcohol for a period of time. And so again, you had growing demands among women for a right to vote, the right to own property, the right to divorce, and increasingly to equal participation. Okay? The reaction of men of this period was, for the most part, one of ridicule. Newspaper editorials overwhelmingly dismissed feminism as an assault on men. The old phrase, who wears the pants in the family, originated in that period, and it is a reactionary, attitude towards women, basically saying, "We demand a voice." That so threatened men of that period that they would, basically go into a shell and say, "You people are making unreasonable demands. You want too much too soon." And we would see this today. There was a backlash again in the 1980s and 90s towards feminism. Rush Limbaugh came to prominence, ranting about feminazis, if you remember that phrase of the period. So relatively few men of that period were respectful of these movements, but a few were. One of which was, of course, John Stuart Mill, who I mentioned in our discussion of liberalism, one of the great English philosophers of the 19th century. He wrote a book called The Subjection of Women. Pictured on this slide is the one woman who he loved in his life, Harriet Taylor. Who was the sort of a long intellectual relationship when her husband died. They had long time been friends, and I believe Mill had been kind of an unrequited love. He had an unrequited love for Taylor. They ended up marrying. Again, he believed her to be of equal intellect to him, and he was, again, a brilliant, brilliant man. And it was that sense in which, have you ever heard the phrase, what was it? First-rate minds hire first-rate people. Second-rate minds hire third-rate people. People who want to marry their intellectual, equals are the type of people who want excellence in their lives. People who want to marry someone who is distinctively less intelligent than them are people who want to control them. People who don't respect those folks and who only view them as sexual objects. And so Mill's The Subjection of Women, basically made the argument, again, for universal education, echoing Wollstonecraft's argument. Basically noting this idea that women can be accomplished if you give them the opportunity. Likewise, Friedrich Engels, the socialist that we talked about in our earlier discussions, the collaborator with Karl Marx, wrote in 1884, published in 1884, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And again, Engels' book provided the philosophical foundation for what would become Marxist feminism, which discussed the institution of monogamous marriage as interwoven with capitalist notions of private property. Engels predicted that once class distinctions had been eliminated, monogamous relationships would come about naturally, and relationships would tend to be more equitable and based on love and respect rather than on property calculations, which again was the dominant way of looking at the world. So when you look at liberal feminism, the agent are women. The obstacles are, again, those legal and institutional features that discriminate against women. And the goal for a liberal feminist is equality of opportunity. For most of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, the dominant theme, the dominant variant of feminism was liberal. And again, from our discussion of liberalism, you know that we're talking about a rights-based argument regarding the status of any set of individuals. And so from a feminist perspective, the liberal feminist argument is that if we eliminate these legal barriers, these state and local laws which bar women from owning property or owning a business, then we go a long way towards achieving equality of opportunity, of giving women that opportunity to achieve within society. In the 20th century, you begin to see important contributions and the building of a theory of the case for feminine equality. And you also begin to see, again, the edifice of an argument regarding feminism and an argument regarding feminine notions of what it means to be human. Simone de Beauvoir, who was a French philosopher, an existentialist philosopher, who really at many times resisted the idea that she was a feminist, and in fact, I think at several points expressly rejected that notion. She was one of the first feminists, or one of the first folks writing within the feminist framework to make the point that there is a distinction to be made between biological sex and the gender of being a woman. She's famously for, if you ever look up famous quotes of Simone de Beauvoir, one of them would be, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Likewise, Betty Friedan, oh God, I got a major misspelling on that one. The feminist critique, or the feminist mystique, basically addresses the increasing feeling of emptiness that women are experiencing because their human potential was being left unfulfilled. Remember, Friedan, in publishing that book in 1963, had been through the 50s, that period in the aftermath of World War II, the late 40s and into the 1950s, where women were expected to go back to the home. And again, this is the point. During World War II, women were unleashed from the household. Close to 20 million men were at war. Women were working in factories. Women were getting jobs to keep their families, fed. And they didn't want to go back. And if you look at the television from that period, Father Knows Best, is a classic example. It really reflects this notion. The woman of the household in Father Knows Best, and most of those shows were kind of these just supportive. Yes, dear. Oh, what a great idea, dear. There was very little independent thought coming from the roles that the women playing those characters in the 1950s. There's very little character in those roles, and that's what Friedan is really kind of pointing to. This sense in which they're simply occupying a space and they're not living for themselves. And that was the Feminine Mystique was a landmark book within feminist literature, and really helped launch the feminist movement of the 1960s. And into the 1970s. And you had, resulting from that book, an explosion of feminist literature and the emergence of several distinctive interpretations of feminism. And so increasingly you see variants of feminism that were often combinations of other ideologies, which we've talked about. Socialist feminists argued that women's freedom is conditioned on the replacement of capitalism with socialism. Much like Friedrich Engels' argument. Anarchist feminists argued that so long as women are oppressed, that as long as the state exists, that women will be subject to oppression. Lesbian separatists, contended that women would confront oppression so long as they remained dependent upon men. There is a sense in which, there is a literature pointing to this sense in which women need to form their own separate communities in order to truly be, equal. Pictured on this slide is Catherine MacKinnon, who was the Elizabeth Long Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. She has specialized in sexual harassment and has basically, she's done groundbreaking work on pornography, basically arguing for the criminalization of pornography, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. So you have also the idea within the literature that there are distinctive waves of federalism. The first wave from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, again, were committed to eliminating legal inequities. The second wave from the 1960s to the early 70s broadened feminist concerns and began making more radical critiques of institutional forms of discrimination. So second wave feminism pointed to masculine norms which denigrated women and fell into the category of the idea of male chauvinism. Sexist attitudes, according to more radical feminists, create a double standard that delegitimize women's efforts to assert themselves. Among the double standards include the assertion that it's unfeminine for women to be successful in scholarly, athletic, or business endeavors, especially in competition with males. That women have no talent for math or science. That assertive actions taken by men are bold, while the same actions taken by women are bossy or bullying. Likewise, when a man seeks compromise, he's being diplomatic, while a woman taking the same action is showing weakness. And so that kind of double standard undermines women in their efforts to succeed in the legal world or in politics. Think about the fact that the United States has never elected a woman president to date. The strategies for fighting sexism include consciousness-raising groups, meetings where women share experiences with work, marriage, and child rearing to kind of, again, get this sense in which we're all kind of experiencing these same challenges of trying to juggle life and work and everything else. Take back the night marches and demonstrations of the 1990s and into the 2000s. I think they're still doing it. Have attempted to publicize the prevalence of rape and the fact that many women don't feel safe walking alone at night. The rise of women's studies programs in colleges and universities, and the politics of this idea of her story, of including feminine narratives within the framework of more broad understandings of American history or world history. And these kinds of things are all, to some extent, under assault, because they are perceived, there are increasingly attacks on women's studies programs as being somehow a waste of time. I mean, the last thing we're going to talk about is the idea that you also see the emergence of difference theories, the emergence of more radical theories of feminism that emphasize essentialist differences between men and women. Women don't simply have different biological makeups; they have different attitudes and values. On this slide is a book by Carol Gilligan, written in 1982, in a different voice, which basically made the argument that women reason morally differently from men. And so radical feminists contended that women should not be objectified, but instead treated as whole beings. And this is where the whole anti-pornography debates of the 1970s and 80s occurred. And you have women on both sides of that debate today, where on the one hand you've got people like more legal and frankly Marxist feminists like Catherine MacKinnon arguing that pornography should be criminalized, and then you have some women saying no, sex, women need to appropriate sex as well. We are sexual beings. We should have narratives about sex that are fulfilling. And so I'm going to close on that note. When we come back, we are going to continue our discussion of feminism and other forms of liberation ideologies. I'll see you next time.